The morning my brother's lawyer walked into the conference room and said, "Dr. Calloway, we weren't expecting you on this side of the table," I watched my brother's face go completely still. He had spent 18 years believing he'd left me with nothing. He was wrong, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning, to the night everything fell apart and the woman who made sure it didn't destroy me. I grew up in a small town in rural Ohio. The kind of place where everybody knows your last name and your grandmother's last name, and they hold both against you if you give them a reason. My family wasn't wealthy, but my father had built a decent contracting business and my mother taught third grade at the elementary school 2 blocks from our house. We weren't struggling. We had a nice home, a yard with a tire swing, and every Sunday dinner we sat at the same table and pretended we were the family we looked like from the outside. My brother was 4 years older than me. My parents treated him like the sun rose specifically for him. He was the firstborn son of a firstborn son. And in our family, that meant something unspoken but constant. A kind of invisible priority that shaped everything from who got the bigger bedroom to who got believed when stories didn't match up. I learned early not to fight that current. I just learned to swim quietly in my own lane. I was not a troublemaker. I made good grades. I worked at the diner on weekends. I read books nobody assigned me. I had a plan. I wanted to become a doctor, not because anyone pushed me toward it, but because when I was 9 years old, a physician named Dr. Helen Marsh held my hand during a terrible bout of pneumonia and talked to me like I was a person worth saving. I never forgot that. I carried it around like a compass. The trouble started the summer before my senior year of high school. My brother had borrowed money from me, $340, which was every cent I'd saved from 6 months of weekend shifts at the diner. He said he needed it for a car repair. He promised he'd pay me back before school started. I believed him because he was my brother and I was 17 and I still believed that family meant something automatic. He never paid me back. When I asked, he laughed. When I pushed harder, he told our parents I'd been harassing him for money I owed him. He flipped it completely. He looked them in the eye and lied without flinching, and my parents looked at me and chose the story that was easier for them to carry. My mother said I needed to let it go. My father said I was being dramatic. My brother said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear through the open kitchen window, that I'd always been jealous of him, and this was just more proof. I remember standing in that kitchen and feeling something shift inside me. Not breaking exactly, but changing. Like the floor had moved 3 inches to the left and I hadn't moved with it. That was only the beginning. Things got harder after that. The atmosphere in the house became something I had to calculate every morning before I came downstairs. My brother had poisoned the well so thoroughly that even small things, who ate the last of the cereal, who forgot to close the garage, became evidence of my fundamental wrongness. I started staying late at school. I started finding reasons not to come home until dinner. The real fracture happened 6 months later. I had applied for a local scholarship, a small one, $1,500 offered by the town's business association every spring to a graduating senior with financial need and academic promise. I had worked on that application for weeks. I wrote about wanting to study medicine. I wrote about Dr. Marsh. I wrote the truest thing I'd ever put on paper. My brother found a copy of my application on the printer. He had his girlfriend's younger sister, a senior that year, submit an almost identical application using pieces of my essay, my framing, my specific language. Just enough altered to avoid being identical. His girlfriend's sister won. I found out from my guidance counselor who was confused because she recognized the language and thought I might want to know. When I brought it to my parents, my brother denied it completely. He said I was lying, that I'd stolen the idea from her, that this was exactly the kind of thing he'd been warning them about for years. My father stood up from the dinner table and told me that making accusations I couldn't prove against family was something he wouldn't tolerate in his house. I asked him what proof would look like. He told me to go to my room. I went, but I didn't stay. I packed a bag that night, not dramatically, not crying, just quietly and practically, the way you pack when you know you're not coming back. I took my clothes, my books, my savings passbook, my acceptance letter from the pre-med program I'd gotten into at Ohio State, and the little framed photo I kept on my nightstand of me and my grandmother at the county fair when I was 6. I zipped the bag, set it by the door, and sat on the edge of my bed until 3 in the morning thinking about where I could go. There was only one answer. My grandmother lived 40 minutes away in a town even smaller than ours, in a yellow house on a corner lot with a vegetable garden that took up most of the backyard. She was 61 years old, recently widowed, and sharper than anyone gave her credit for. Her name was Eleanor. She went by Ellie, but to me, she had always just been Grandma, which hardly captures what she actually was. I drove to her house in the dark. I knocked on her door at 3:45 in the morning. She opened it in her bathrobe, took one look at my bag and my face, and stepped aside to let me in. She didn't ask what happened right away. She put the kettle on first. She made tea. She put a plate of crackers and sharp cheddar on the table like it was the most normal thing in the world to have your granddaughter show up in the middle of the night. Then she sat across from me and said, "Tell me everything." So I did. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. She looked out the window at the dark backyard. Then she looked back at me and said, "You are going to become a doctor, and you are going to do it in spite of all of them. And this house is your home for as long as you need it." I tried to tell her it might be a while. She said, "I know, I'm counting on it. I want to pause here and tell you who my grandmother actually was, because she deserves more than a sentence. Eleanor Calloway had raised 3 kids largely on her own while my grandfather worked construction jobs that took him out of state for months at a time. She had never gone to college, but she read constantly. History, medicine, biography, anything she could get from the library's new arrivals shelf. She kept a notebook where she wrote down things she learned. She asked questions like a journalist. She had opinions about everything and apologized for none of them. She also had, it turned out, made some very quiet and very smart financial decisions over the course of her life. She wasn't wealthy, but she was careful, and she was consistent, and she had been putting money away since her late 30s into accounts nobody in the family knew existed. She'd never talked about it. She didn't believe in advertising what you had. Living with her changed me in ways I'm still discovering. She woke up early and expected me to do the same. She made me eat breakfast before I went anywhere. She came to every important school event I'd never had anyone come to before. When I got my acceptance confirmation to Ohio State's pre-med track with a partial scholarship, she framed it and put it on the wall in the hallway next to a painting of the Ohio countryside. She said, "That stays there until you have a medical degree to put next to it." I drove to Columbus that fall. I called her every Sunday. She sent me cards. Actual handwritten cards, with little newspaper clippings she thought I'd find interesting tucked inside. A study about sleep and memory. An article about a small-town doctor who'd started a free clinic. A recipe she'd modified that she thought I should try. She kept track of my life with more attention than anyone ever had. Medical school was hard in the way only medical school can be hard. Not just the volume of information, but the sustained pressure of it. The way it asks something of you every single day with no room to coast. I worked at a campus coffee shop 3 mornings a week to cover what my scholarship didn't. I studied in the library until it closed. There were nights I sat with my head in my hands, genuinely unsure I was going to make it through. On those nights, I called my grandmother. She never told me it would be easy. She never said the wrong, encouraging thing. She just talked to me like a person who had seen hard things and knew they ended. She said once, during a particularly bad stretch in my 2nd year, "Eleanor, you are made of harder material than you think. Stop looking at the whole mountain and just look at the next step." I looked at the next step. I kept going. My parents never reached out during those years. My brother called once, during my 1st year of medical school. Not to apologize, not to check in, but to tell me that my absence had upset our mother and that I should call her. He said I was being selfish. I listened to the full voicemail twice, then I deleted it and didn't call back. My grandmother didn't push me toward reconciliation, but she didn't push me away from it either. She believed in letting things settle at their own pace. She said some wounds need time more than they need words. I graduated from medical school on a Saturday in May. My grandmother sat in the third row in a blue dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion. When they called my name and I walked across the stage, I looked out at the audience and found her face, and she was crying. Not dramatically, just quietly, with her hands folded in her lap and a smile that I will keep with me for the rest of my life. Afterward, she hugged me for a long time and said, "I told you." I matched into an internal medicine residency in Cincinnati. 3 years of residency, then a fellowship in hospital medicine. I built a career methodically, the way she'd taught me to build everything. One step, then the next. I joined a practice in a mid-sized city in southern Ohio, eventually became a partner, and 8 years after my grandmother watched me walk across that stage, I was named chief of medicine at a regional hospital. My grandmother had been declining slowly for about 2 years by then. Nothing sudden. Her heart had been giving her trouble, and she moved more carefully than she used to, and the garden she'd kept so meticulously had gotten a little wilder at the edges because she tired more quickly. But she was still sharp, still reading, still keeping her notebook. She called me one evening in October and talked for over an hour about a biography she was reading about Clara Barton. She said she thought more people should know that Clara Barton had started the Red Cross at age 60. "There's a lesson in that," she said. I told her I thought she was teaching me lessons right up until the end. She laughed and said, "Well, I'm not done yet." She was gone 3 weeks later. A heart attack, in the night, peaceful according to the paramedics. She was 73 years old. The grief was enormous and also, strangely, clean. She had lived fully. She had loved generously. She had done exactly what she set out to do, including making sure I was going to be all right. The funeral was small. Some of her friends from church, a few neighbors, her remaining siblings, and me. I read something I'd written the night before. I talked about the tea and the crackers at 3:45 in the morning. I talked about the framed acceptance letter in the hallway. I talked about what it meant to be chosen by someone when your own family had chosen not to choose you. Afterward, her attorney, a quiet man named Mr. Dobbins, who had known her for 30 years, pulled me aside and told me that she had updated her will 5 years ago. She had left me everything: the house, the accounts, the investments she'd never talked about. The total came to just over $1.9 million. I stood very still in the church parking lot and let that settle. I had not known. I genuinely had not known. Mr. Dobbins told me that she had specifically excluded her other family members, including her son, my father, and had left documentation explaining her reasoning in clear, legal terms. She had done this thoughtfully and thoroughly, the way she did everything. I drove home in silence. I sat in my apartment for a long time. I thought about the yellow house and the vegetable garden and the cards with newspaper clippings. I thought about a woman who had stretched her arms across a chasm and held on. 6 months later, I received a certified letter. My brother and my parents were contesting the will. They had retained an attorney, a man named Gerald Foss from a firm in Columbus, and they were filing a challenge on grounds of undue influence, the claim being that I had manipulated my grandmother into changing her will and cutting out the rest of the family. They were seeking the full estate. I read the letter standing at my kitchen counter. Then I called my own attorney. I should tell you something about my professional life that became relevant here. The hospital system I worked for had gone through a significant administrative restructuring 2 years earlier. As chief of medicine, I had become deeply involved in hospital policy, credentialing, and, through a collaborative process with the hospital's legal department, I had developed a working relationship with several local attorneys and judges. The legal and medical communities in our region overlapped in ways that outsiders don't always anticipate. Depositions, malpractice consultations, hospital board meetings. You get to know people. I knew Gerald Foss by reputation. We had never worked together, but I had been in rooms he had been in. I had sat on a panel discussion once where he was in the audience. He had no particular reason to know who I was. My family, it turned out, had given him no relevant background on my professional life whatsoever. They had told him my name and that I was some kind of doctor in Cincinnati. They apparently had not mentioned that I had spent the last 2 years serving on the Ethics and Credentialing Committee of the Ohio State Medical Association, or that I had been appointed to the State Health Policy Advisory Board the previous year, or that in our region's medical legal community. I was not exactly unknown. None of that came up until the mediation. We met at the offices of a neutral mediator, a woman named Judge Harriet Bloom, retired, who specialized in estate disputes. She was calm, precise, and had clearly done this hundreds of times. My attorney and I arrived first. Gerald Foss arrived with my brother and my parents a few minutes later. My brother looked older. So did my parents. My mother had her hands folded in her lap the way she used to sit at church. My father looked at the window. My brother looked at me for a moment, then away. When everyone was seated, Judge Bloom began the introductions. She asked each attorney to introduce their clients. My attorney said, "My client is Dr. Eleanor Calloway, Chief of Medicine at..." I watched Gerald Foss stop writing mid-sentence. He looked up slowly. He looked at me. Then he looked at my brother, who was staring at the table. Then he looked back at me. His expression went through several things in the space of about 4 seconds. He set down his pen. He said, very quietly, "Dr. Calloway, I wasn't aware of your position." My father finally looked away from the window. Gerald Foss was a competent attorney. I want to be clear about that. What happened next was not incompetence. It was the natural outcome of a case that should never have been filed. He knew in that moment that my family had handed him a deeply weak case with critical information withheld. He knew that the medical legal community in our state was smaller than it looked. He knew what the evidence actually showed. 12 years of documented financial decisions by a woman of clear and sound mind, witnessed and notarized, with a letter of explanation so thorough that it read like the closing argument of a woman who had anticipated exactly this challenge. He knew none of this had a realistic path forward. Over the next hour, as the mediation proceeded, the case against me dissolved piece by piece. My grandmother had worked with Mr. Dobbins over a period of years. There were records of her explicitly initiating each update. There were notes in her own handwriting. There were witnesses. The claim of undue influence had, in practical terms, nothing to stand on. My brother said almost nothing. My mother cried quietly at one point. My father sat with his jaw tight and his eyes on his hands. At the end of the session, Gerald Foss recommended that his clients withdraw the challenge. He said it in professional terms, but the meaning was clear. My attorney and I stepped out into the hallway while they conferred. She looked at me and said, "You okay?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "I think so." We settled it fully within 3 weeks. The challenge was withdrawn. The estate remained mine, exactly as my grandmother had intended. My attorney offered to file a counter-motion for legal fees. I told her not to. People ask me about that sometimes. Why not press harder? Why not make them pay the costs? Why not go further? I think about what my grandmother would have said. She was not a vengeful woman. She was a precise one. She had already said exactly what she wanted to say in her will, in her documentation, in the letter she left with Mr. Dobbins. She had made her statement. It didn't need me to add to it. But I did meet them afterward. My attorney thought I was making a mistake. I asked her to give me an hour. We sat in the diner 6 blocks from the mediator's office. My brother arrived late. My parents sat across from me like people waiting for a sentence to be read. I looked at my father and I thought about the kitchen table in the summer when I was 17 and how easy it would have been for him to choose differently. I thought about how one moment of actually seeing me might have changed everything. I thought about how much of my life had been shaped by people who hadn't looked closely enough. I didn't say any of that. I told them that my grandmother had loved all of us in different ways and for different reasons, and that what she'd chosen to do with her estate was her decision, made clearly and freely, and that I was going to honor it by using it to build something she would have been proud of. I told them I was not interested in ongoing conflict. I told them the door was not locked forever, but that walking through it would require something different from all of us, and that I wasn't going to be the only one doing the work. My brother looked at the table. My mother said she was sorry, though I wasn't entirely sure what she was sorry for. My father nodded once, slowly, like a man trying to locate himself after a long time away. I drove home in the early evening. I stopped at the florist I passed on my usual route and bought a simple bunch of yellow flowers, the color of her house. I drove to the cemetery. I stood at her grave for a while without saying anything formal, just standing there the way you do when you want someone to know you're still showing up. The light was going gold and long the way it does in Ohio in the late afternoon, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look like they mean something. I thought about a woman in a bathrobe opening her door at 3:45 in the morning. I thought about a plate of crackers and a cup of tea. I thought about what it costs someone to love you correctly, and what it means to try to be worth that. I set the yellow flowers down. I said, "I'm okay. You can rest." Then I got in my car and drove back toward the life she had helped me build, carrying everything she'd given me, and nothing that was never really mine to begin with.